The year is 1873, but time, in the village of Oho, does not move with the ticking of clocks or the turning of seasons. It moves in the thickness of the dust, motes dancing in a sliver of gray morning light. It moves in the slow, agonizing crawl of dampness up the floral wallpaper of a cramped upstairs bedroom. In the late 19th century, death was a neighbor. It lived in the soot of the coal fires. It lingered in the coughing fits of the textile workers. It sat at the dinner table in the form of an empty chair. The people of this era were intimately acquainted with the coldness of a corpse. They knew the smell of lily and formaldehyde. But they were not prepared for Emma Richter, because Emma Richter refused to choose a side. She sat on the razor's edge between the kingdom of the living and the silent empire of the dead. And for years, she refused to fall. To understand the horror of Emma Richter, you must first understand the room. Imagine a space where the air has not been exchanged in 1,000 days. It is heavy, sweet, and metallic. It smells of lavender oil used to mask the scent of stagnant flesh, of unwashed linens, and of the sharp, acidic tang of medicinal tinctures that have long since evaporated in their glass vials. The curtains are heavy velvet, stained by the sun into a sickly brownish red. They are kept drawn, always drawn, because out there, in the world of 1873, there is progress. There are steam engines screaming across the Prussian countryside. There are telegraph wires humming with the frantic thoughts of a modernizing world. But inside this room, there's only the rhythmic, terrifyingly shallow sound of a breath that should not be. Ha 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 ha. That is a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. It is the sound of a lung that has forgotten the joy of a deep gasp, settled instead for the bare minimum required to keep the blood from curdling in the veins. It began on a Tuesday. A Tuesday that started with the mundane clatter of milk pails and the distant ringing of the church bell. Frau Richter, a woman whose face was already a roadmap of Prussian hardship, climbed the narrow wooden stairs to wake her daughter. Emma was 17. A girl of vivacious spirit. The local papers would later claim, though small-town papers always say that about the vanished. She was a girl of flaxen hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. She had gone to bed complaining of nothing more than a heaviness in the marrow, a phrase that, in 1873, could mean anything from a passing flu to the onset of the Black Death. Frau Richter pushed the door open. The hinges gave a low, mournful protest. The room was cold, bitterly so, for the fire had died in the great hours ago. Emma, the mother whispered, thought there was no movement. The girl lay on her back, her hands folded over her chest in a way that mimicked the effigies found on the tombs of crusaders. Her skin was not the pale white of the dead. It was a translucent, waxy yellow, like a candle that had been left in the sun. The mother reached out. This is the moment where the horror truly begins, not with a scream, but with a touch. She expected the icy rigidity of a corpse. She expected to recoil from the soul-chilling cold of a body that had surrendered its heat to the night. Instead, Emma was warm. She was warm, but she was hollow. When Frau Richter pressed her hand to her daughter's cheek, the flesh yielded. It was soft. It was supple. It was alive. But Emma's eyes, though closed, felt like marbles beneath the lids. There was no fluttering of the lashes, no morning breath caught in the throat. Frau Richter shook her. She shook her until the bedframe rattled against the floorboards. She screamed her name until her own throat bled. She took a sewing needle from the knitstand and, in a fit of hysterical terror, drove it deep into the meat of Emma's thumb. A single, perfect bead of crimson blood bloomed on the surface of the skin. Emma did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply continued that rhythmic, papery breathing. Within hours, the quiet house in Oho was no longer a sanctuary. It was a crime scene where the criminal was nature itself. The local physician, A man named Dr. Hartman arrived with his leather bag of Victorian horrors. He was a man of science, which in 1873 meant he was a man of arrogance. He believed the human body was a machine, and machines did not simply stop without a broken gear. He performed the tests of the threshold. He held a silver mirror to Emma's lips. A faint, ghostly fog appeared, proving the lungs were active. He took a candle and held the flame so close to her forearm that the fine hairs singed, and the scent of burnt protein filled the room. The skin blistered. The body did not pull away. "It is a trance," Hartman declared, his voice trembling despite his training. "A hysterical lethargy. The mind has retreated into the basement of the soul, and it has locked the door from the inside." But as the sun began to set on that first day, a darker realization settled over the household. Emma wasn't just asleep. She was being kept. Something about the way she lay there, so still, so perfectly preserved, suggested she was a vessel being held in stasis. The village priest was the next to arrive. He did not bring a stethoscope. He brought holy water and a heavy, silver-bound Bible. He stood at the foot of the bed and felt a coldness that Dr. Hartman's thermometer could not register. He saw the way the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lean inward, toward the bed, as if they were whispering to the girl who couldn't hear. "This is not a sickness of the flesh," the priest whispered to the mother. "This is a suspension of the spirit. Her soul is standing on the porch of heaven, but she is being forbidden from entering." As the first week bled into the second, the horror shifted from the acute to the chronic. The town of Ojo began to change. The villagers began to gather outside the house. They didn't speak. They just watched the upper window. They were waiting for the moment she woke up or the moment she finally rotted. But she did neither. Inside the room, the biological horror intensified. How do you feed a girl who cannot swallow? They began to drop milk and broth into the corner of her mouth with a glass dropper. Most of it ran down her chin, soaking into the pillowcase, creating a damp, sour environment that invited mold. They had to turn her body every few hours to prevent the bedsores from eating through her skin to the bone. When they moved her, her limbs were heavy, not with the stiffness of death, but with a strange, gelatinous weight. Her joints creaked like old furniture. The most terrifying part, however, was the eyes. Sometimes, in the dead of night, the lids would part just a fraction of a millimeter. Not because she was waking, but because the muscles were losing their tension. If you held a lamp to her face, you could see the iris, a frozen, clouded blue. It didn't track the light. It didn't dilate. It stared through the ceiling, through the roof, through the very fabric of the stars, looking at something the living were never meant to see. The medical journals of the time began to pick up the story. They called it a case of suspended animation. They spoke of it in cold, clinical terms. But in the dark pubs of Ojo, they called it something else. They called it the debt. They whispered that Emma Richter had traded her waking life for something else. And now the something else was coming to collect. By the end of the first month, the bedroom had become a tomb that refused to be sealed. Frau Richter had stopped crying. She sat in a wooden chair by the bed, a knitting needle in her hand that never moved. She watched her daughter's chest rise and fall. Ha 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 ha. She began to realize that the girl in the bed was a stranger. The Emma she knew, the girl who liked strawberry jam and feared thunderstorms, was gone. What remained was a biological clock, ticking away in a vacuum. One night, as the moon hung like a pale, diseased lung over the village, Frau Richter leaned in close to Emma's ear. "Where are you?" she whispered. The wind caught in the chimney, a low, howling moan that sounded like a response. And for a split second, a heartbeat's worth of time, the mother thought she saw Emma's throat muscles ripple. Not a swallow, not a word, but a struggle, as if something inside that suspended body was trying to claw its way up the esophagus to get out. The horror of 1873 wasn't that Emma Richter might die. Horror was that she might stay exactly like this forever. A living corpse. A breathing statue. A girl science couldn't explain, and that God seemed to have forgotten. This was only the beginning. The circus was coming. The experts were coming. And in the darkness of the Ojo woods, something was waking up just as Emma was falling asleep. By the winter of 1873, the Richter house had ceased to be a home. It had become a laboratory, a theater, and a temple of the grotesque. As the story of the sleeping girl of Ojo spread through the telegraph wires of Europe, it eventually reached the ears of a man who dealt not in healing, but in the cold, hard mechanics of the human machine. His name was Dr. Alistair Van Eyck. He arrived on a carriage that seemed to swallow the light, pulled by horses whose ribs showed through their coats like the keys of a piano. Van Eyck was a man of the new age, a proponent of radical physiology. He did not believe in the soul. He believed in the circuit. To him, Emma Richter was not a suffering child or a spiritual mystery. She was a broken watch, and he was the horologist come to pry open the casing. When he stepped into the sick room, the atmosphere shifted. He didn't offer a prayer or a kind word to Frau Richter. Instead, he unpacked a mahogany case lined with blue velvet. Inside were the tools of a modern inquisitor, silver-plated needles, glass tubes of mercury, and the crowning jewel of his collection, a massive humming galvanic battery. "The girl is not asleep," Van Eyck declared, his voice like the grinding of stones. "She is simply untriggered. We shall find the lever that restores the motion." The neighbors watched through the frosted windows as the room flickered with a strange, unnatural blue light. In 1873, electricity was still a magic trick to the common man, a terrifying force of nature that Benjamin Franklin had pulled from the clouds and Volta had trapped in jars. Van Eyck began what he called the awakening protocols. First came the chemicals. He saturated sponges and concentrated ammonia and pressed them directly against Emma's nostrils until the delicate skin began to peel and raw. Red patches appeared. He was looking for the sneezing reflex, the violent rejection of the body to poison. Emma's chest continued its slow, rhythmic dance. She accepted the poison as if it were mountain air. Next came the sensory deprivation. He ordered the windows boarded up entirely, plunging the room into a darkness so absolute that the nurses felt they were drowning. He wanted to see if the brain, starved of all input, would reset itself in a panic. For 72 hours, Emma lay in a void. No sound, no light, no touch. When they finally tore the boards away, the sunlight hit her eyes, those frozen, clouded orbs. They did not blink. They did not water. They were like the eyes of a fish deep in the trench of the ocean, adapted to a darkness that Van Eyck could not fathom. A lie. It was a medical menagerie, a puppet show where the strings were made of copper and the puppeteer was a madman with a battery. Frau Richter fell to her knees, sobbing, begging the doctor to stop as she watched her daughter's body thrash in a rhythmic, mechanical seizure. But Van Eyck's eyes were wide, reflecting the blue sparks. He wasn't looking for Emma. He was looking for the ghost in the machine. When the power was cut, Emma collapsed back into the bed. The smell of ozone and singed hair hung heavy in the air. She lay there, perfectly still once more, her breathing unchanged. It was during these weeks of intense study that the staff began to notice the things that didn't make sense, even for a medical mystery. A nurse, tasked with washing Emma's hair, reported that the water in the basin turned black not with dirt, but with a thick, ink-like substance that stained the porcelain. When she tried to scrub it away, the stains rearranged themselves into patterns that looked uncomfortably like human faces. Then there was the matter of the weight. Dr. Van Eyck insisted on weighing Emma every morning. Despite the fact that she was consuming only a few ounces of broth a day, she was gaining weight. Not in a way that made her look healthy or plump, but a dense, heavy mass that made the wooden bedframe groan and crack under her. By the 3rd month of her sleep, she weighed more than a grown man, though her frame remained that of a slender 17-year-old girl. It is as if she is absorbing the room, Van Eyck noted in his journal, his handwriting becoming increasingly erratic, as if her body is becoming more solid, more permanent. While the rest of us age and wither, she's becoming a monolith. The medical community eventually turned on Van Eyck, not because they cared for Emma, but because he had failed to produce a result. The suspended animation had become a public embarrassment to the logic of the Victorian age. But as the doctors packed their bags and the menagerie disbanded, they left behind something far worse than they found. They had poked and prodded the veil. They had used electricity and poison to try and drag a soul back from a place they didn't understand. The room was now scarred. The wallpaper was charred from the sparks. The floor was stained with chemicals, and the air was thick with the residue of 100 failed resurrections. As Van Eyck boarded his carriage to leave, he looked back at the window one last time. He later told a colleague in Berlin that for a split second, he didn't see Emma Richter in the bed. He saw a hole in the shape of a girl, a void in the middle of the room that was drawing the very heat and life out of the house. Emma was still breathing. But the medical menagerie had proven one thing. Science could explain the pulse. It could explain the reflex. It could even explain the electricity of the heart. But it could not explain the shadow that was now growing behind Emma's closed eyelids, a shadow that was starting to look back at them. By the spring of 1874, the scientific community had largely retreated, defeated by the stubborn silence of Emma Richter. But where the doctors saw a failure, the world saw a miracle. In the 1800s, the line between a house of God and a sideshow tent was razor thin, and the Richter cottage was about to be pulled across it. Word had traveled far beyond the borders of Westphalia. It traveled in the pockets of merchants and on the grease-stained pages of penny dreadfuls, sensationalist tabloids that painted Emma not as a sick girl, but as a saint of the silent breath or the sleeping vampire of Oho. The village, once a quiet collection of coal-stained houses and damp taverns, began to transform. It was the birth of a dark tourism. First came the neighbors, then the surrounding districts, and finally, the curious men in top hats and women in heavy mourning veils who traveled by rail from as far as London and Paris, just to stand in the presence of a girl who had forgotten how to die. Frau Richter's grief, once a private and holy thing, was slowly eroded by the grinding pressure of poverty and the relentless knocking at her door. It began with a few coins offered for the girl's care. It ended with a formal ticketing system. The house was reorganized to accommodate the flow. The front parlor became a waiting room where tea and commemorative scraps of lace, supposedly blessed by being near Emma, were sold for exorbitant prices. The stairs were reinforced with iron brackets to support the weight of the hundreds who climbed them daily. The air in the house changed. It no longer smelled of just lavender and stagnant medicine. It smelled of the great unwashed. It smelled of damp wool, cheap tobacco, and the desperate, frantic energy of people looking for a sign from the afterlife. When a visitor finally reached the threshold of the bedroom, the rules were strict: silence, no touching, no more than 2 minutes. There's a specific kind of horror in being watched while you are helpless. Emma lay in the center of the room like a relic in a cathedral. To the pilgrims, she was no longer a human being. She was a bridge. The wealthy would lean over her, their expensive perfumes clashing with the scent of her slowing metabolism, searching her face for a twitch, a sign, a prophecy. Some believed that if they whispered their secrets into her ear, she would carry them to the other side while she slept. They whispered of murders, of thefts, of illicit loves. pouring their filth into the mind of a girl who could not defend herself. But the curious brought more than just secrets. They brought a dark, voyeuristic cruelty. When the guards, local boys hired by the mother, weren't looking, visitors would test the miracle for themselves. They would drop hot candle wax on her hands to see if she would flinch. They would press sharp thimbles into her skin. One account from a London journalist described a woman who tried to peel back Emma's eyelid with a fingernail. Desperate to see if the sleeping girl was truly looking at heaven or merely staring into the void of the room. Emma remained a statue. She absorbed the cruelty, the wax and the whispers, her chest rising and falling with that same haunting rhythm. Ha 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 ha. As the months of the pilgrimage wore on, the horror began to migrate from the girl to the room itself. Those who stayed too long began to report a sensation of thickening air. It was said that the mirrors in the Richter house began to fail. People would look into them and see the room behind them clearly, but their own reflections would be blurred, as if they were being erased. Others claimed that the ticking of their pocket watches would sync up perfectly with Emma's breathing, and then, inexplicably, stop altogether. The most chilling reports came from the night watchmen, the men paid to sit with Emma after the tourists had been cleared out. They spoke of the shadow Emma. They claimed that in the low light of a single tallow candle, the shadow cast by Emma's body on the wall didn't match her physical form. While the girl lay perfectly flat, her shadow appeared to be sitting up. It appeared to be leaning forward, its head tilted as if listening to the house. When a watchman moved the candle, the shadow would snap back into place, but the feeling of being watched by a silhouette remained. The village of Oho flourished. New inns were built. The blacksmith turned his hand to making Emma charms. The town was feeding on the girl's stasis. They needed her to stay asleep. The horror was no longer that she wouldn't wake up. It was the fear that she would. If Emma Richter opened her eyes, the economy of Oho would collapse. The saint would become a mere girl again, and the curious would take their gold elsewhere. This created a sickening atmosphere of protective malice. The villagers began to treat the house like a fortress. They became hostile to any doctor who suggested a new treatment. They wanted the suspended animation to be eternal. They were, in effect, keeping her a prisoner in her own coma, surrounding her with a wall of greed and superstition. One evening, a high-ranking official from the Prussian government arrived to investigate this spectacle. He entered the room, stayed for precisely 1 minute, and ran out, vomiting in the hallway. When asked what he had seen, he didn't speak of a sleeping girl. He spoke of a sinkhole. He said the room felt like a mouth that was slowly closing, and that every person who entered was giving a little bit of their own vitality to keep the girl's heart beating. The era of the curious ended not with a ban, but with a scream. A young man from Berlin, a student of the occult, had bribed a guard to let him stay in the room alone for an hour. What happened in that hour was never fully explained. The villagers heard a sound like a heavy weight being dropped, followed by a silence so profound it seemed to deafen the entire street. When they broke down the door, the student was found huddled in the corner, his hair having turned white in a single hour. He was pointing at Emma. She had not moved. She had not woken. But the student swore that the breath had changed. He claimed that for a few seconds the rhythm had stopped, and a voice not coming from her throat, but from the air around her had whispered his own mother's death date. After that, the crowds thinned. The curious became the terrified. The pilgrimage was over, leaving the Richter house in a state of rotting luxury, filled with unsold charms and the lingering, heavy scent of 1,000 strangers. Emma was alone again, but she was no longer the same girl who had fallen asleep in 1873. She had been fed by the gazes of thousands, and in the dark silence of the post-pilgrimage house, she began to grow. Not in size, but in presence. The suspended animation was entering its most dangerous phase. The body was no longer just a vessel. It was a magnet, and the things it was beginning to attract from the shadows of the 19th century were far worse than any tourist dot by the autumn of 1874. The silence in the Richter house had become heavy, not the peaceful silence of a sleeping child, but the pressurized, ringing silence of a tomb. The doctors had failed with their batteries. The tourists had fled with their superstitions. Into this vacuum stepped the last resort of the desperate, the seekers of the unseen world. In the late 1800s, spiritualism had moved from the fringe to the parlor. It was the era of the Fox sisters, of table turning, and of ectoplasm. To the spiritualist circles of Europe, Emma Richter was not a medical anomaly. She was a natural somnambulist, a rare biological bridge through which the dead might speak. They arrived in Ohull during the season of the dying leaves, a group of 3 led by a Madame Valeska, a woman with eyes like smoked glass and a reputation for unzipping the veil. They were joined by the local priest, Father Klimt, who had abandoned his prayers for a bottle of holy water and a sense of mounting dread. "The girl is not here," Madame Valeska whispered as she stepped into the bedroom, her voice raspy from years of simulated trances. "The house is empty." And when a house is left empty for too long, the vagrants of the spirit world begin to move in. The plan was a circle of invitation. They would not try to wake the body. They would try to find the soul in the liminal space, the gray territory, between the waking world and the afterlife. The scene was a masterpiece of Victorian Gothic horror. A single oil lamp burned on the floor, casting long shivering shadows that stretched up the walls like skeletal fingers. Madame Valeska sat at the bedside, her hand hovering just inches above Emma's cold, waxy forehead. Father Klimt stood by the door, clutching his rosary so tight the beads left indentations in his palms. "Emma Richter," Valeska intoned, her head snapping back. "We call to the occupant. We call to the tenant of the bone." At first, there was nothing but the papery rhythm of the breath. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted. It was not the chill of an open window, but a predatory cold that seemed to suck the heat directly out of the blood. The flame of the oil lamp didn't flicker. It turned a deep, bruised purple, the light shrinking until it was no larger than a grape. Madame Valeska's hand suddenly dropped, making contact with Emma's skin. The medium's body jerked as if she had touched a live wire. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, mimicking Emma's own frozen gaze. "It's crowded," Valeska gasped, her voice now layered with a strange metallic resonance. "So many voices. They are all huddled in the dark, waiting for her to move." "Who is waiting?" Father Klimt hissed, stepping forward. "The ones who were forgotten," the medium replied, but the voice was no longer hers. It was deeper, slower, and it carried the sound of shifting earth. The girl left the door unlatched. She went for a walk in the tall grass of the great sleep, and she didn't look back. Now the things that live in the grass have found her path. Suddenly the bed groaned. This was the dense, unnatural weight the doctors had noted, the monolith effect. The wooden frame began to splinter. The sound of cracking oak filled the room like a series of small gunshots. The medium began to weep, but the tears were thick and dark, staining her cheeks like soot. "She is being filled," Valeska shrieked. "She is a vessel. They are pouring the darkness of the century into her. Every unspoken sin, every buried scream of this village. It's finding a home in her marrow." The horror shifted from the auditory to the visual. Father Klimt looked at the wall behind the bed. The shadow of the girl, which had been a point of local legend, was no longer just a silhouette. It was three-dimensional. It appeared to peel itself off the floral wallpaper, a blacker-than-black shape that stood over the sleeping Emma. It had no face, only a jagged rip where a mouth should be. The shadow leaned over the medium. Valeska's jaw unhinged. her mouth opening wider than humanly possible. A sound emerged from the medium's throat that would haunt Father Klimt until his dying day. It was the sound of 1,000 people whispering at once, a chaotic static of names, dates, and sins. It was the record of the dead. It spoke of the coal miner buried in the 1850 collapse. It spoke of the infant drowned in the creek. It spoke of the secrets the tourists had whispered into Emma's ear during the pilgrimage. Emma's body, for the first time in years, reacted. Her chest didn't just rise. It expanded. Her rib cage flared out with a wet, popping sound, stretching the skin of her nightgown until the fabric shredded. Her fingers curled into claws, the nails scratching long, deep grooves into the mahogany bedposts. "Stop it!" the mother cried from the doorway, breaking the circle. "You're hurting her." The moment the circle of hands was broken, the energy in the room snapped like a whip. The oil lamp exploded, showering the floor in burning glass. The medium was thrown backward against the wardrobe, falling unconscious. In the sudden, suffocating darkness, there was a sound of a heavy, wet indrawing of breath. It was the first deep breath Emma had taken in over a year. It was the sound of a vacuum finally being filled. It was the first deep breath Emma had taken in over a year. It was the sound of a vacuum finally being filled. When Father Klimt finally managed to strike a match, the room was empty of spirits. The shadow had returned to the wall. Madame Valeska was a broken heap on the floor. But Emma was different. Her skin, once waxy and yellow, was now a vibrant, healthy pink. Her lips were red, as if she had just finished a feast. But she did not wake. She remained suspended, yet she looked more alive than anyone else in the room. It was the look of a predator that had finally been fed. The spiritualists left Oho the next morning. They did not take their fee. Madame Valeska refused to speak, her eyes darting to every shadow in the carriage as if expecting it to rise and swallow her. Father Klimt returned to his church, but he no longer prayed for Emma's recovery. He began to petition the bishop for a rite of final sealing, not an exorcism of a person, but the sealing of a doorway. "The girl we knew is a ghost," he wrote in his secret ledger. "What lies in that bed now is a tulpa of our own making. We have stared at her for so long, we have whispered so much into her ears, that we have breathed a collective monster into existence. She is no longer Emma Richter. She is the repository, and may God help us when the repository finally opens." The village of Oho fell into a new kind of fear. It was no longer the fear of a mystery, but the fear of a ticking clock. They realized that Emma Richter wasn't just sleeping. She was waiting for the world to get dark enough for her to finally wake up. By the winter of 1875, the sleeping girl of Oho had entered a phase that moved beyond the spiritual or the medical. It was the beginning of a biological insurrection. In the 1800s, the human body was understood through the lens of anatomy books and marble statues, fixed, logical, and divine. Emma Richter was beginning to rewrite those laws in the most grotesque ways imaginable. The room had become a terrarium of the impossible. The heat that Dr. Van Eyck had once tried to jumpstart with batteries was now being generated by Emma herself. Despite the frost that cracked the window panes and the bitter Prussian wind that whistled through the eaves, the bedroom remained at a sweltering, humid temperature. The wallpaper began to peel away in long wet strips, revealing the damp lath beneath, which appeared to be pulsing with a rhythm that matched the girl's heart. The horror was no longer that she wouldn't move. It was that she was changing while remaining perfectly still. Frau Richter was the first to notice the glaze. While bathing her daughter, she realized that Emma's skin no longer felt like human tissue. It had taken on the texture of polished marble or fine porcelain, cold, hard, and strangely translucent. When the light of a candle passed behind her hand, one could see not just the bones, but a network of veins that had turned to shimmering, iridescent black. The weight that had baffled the doctors had become an anchor. The bed had finally given way, the heavy mahogany frame snapping like dry twigs under a mass that no human frame should possess. They had moved her to a reinforced pallet on the floor, yet even there, the floorboards began to bow and groan, but the most visceral rebellion was the hair. Emma's flaxen hair had begun to grow with a predatory speed. It spilled off the pallet, coiling across the floor like golden wire. It didn't just lay there. It seemed to seek out the cracks in the floorboards, threading itself into the very foundation of the house. When a nurse tried to trim it with silver shears, the blades snapped. The hair didn't cut. It screamed a high-pitched, harmonic vibration that shattered the medicine bottles on the knitstand dot in the dead of night. The suspended body began to exhibit what the local watchman called the automata. It began with the fingers. They would move in a rapid, blurring motion, as if Emma were playing an invisible piano at a tempo no human could achieve. Her hands would weave complex patterns in the air, braiding the air itself, before snapping back into their folded position over her chest. Then came the eyes. The eyelids would slide open with a wet, suction-like sound. The clouded blue irises were gone, replaced by a surface that was perfectly reflective. If you looked into Emma's eyes, you didn't see her soul. You saw yourself distorted, miniature, and terrified. She had become a mirror for the world's rot. One night, the village watchman reported seeing Emma's jaw unhinged not for a breath, but to allow a swarm of white moths to crawl out from her throat. They fluttered around the room, their wings dusty with a fine gray powder that smelled of old graves and dried lily, before retreating back into the darkness of her mouth. A body that changes requires fuel. Yet, Emma had stopped accepting the dropper of milk months ago. Her throat had closed, becoming a solid column of that marble-like flesh. And yet, she was thriving. The house began to suffer. The vegetable garden outside the window withered into black sludge overnight. The family dog, a loyal hound that had slept at the foot of the stairs, grew thin and skeletal, its fur falling out in clumps until it finally fled into the woods, howling as if it had seen the face of the devil. The house was being eaten. The wood grew brittle. The iron nails rusted into dust. The very vitality of the living residence was being drawn upward through the floorboards and into the pallet where the girl lay. Frau Richter's hair turned white, and her skin became papery and thin, as if her daughter were a parasite, drinking the years out of her mother's life to fuel her own impossible transformation. In a final act of desperation, a young medical student from the university, a boy who didn't know enough to be afraid, sneaked into the room with a primitive stethoscope. He wanted to hear the heart of a suspended girl. He placed the cold metal bell against Emma's chest. He didn't hear a heartbeat. He heard a city. He heard the sound of thousands of voices, the clanging of bells, the rushing of water, and the grinding of massive, unseen gears. It wasn't the sound of a biological organ. It was the sound of a civilization living inside a ribcage. He pulled back, his face a mask of horror, and as he did, he saw the skin of Emma's chest ripple. A face small, perfect, and weeping pushed its way up from beneath her skin, pressed against the translucent surface for a moment like a prisoner behind glass, and then sank back into the depths of her torso. The body's rebellion was complete. Emma Richter was no longer a girl in a coma. She had become a biological temple, a living prison for something that had no name. In the 1800s, she was a biological miracle that had curdled into an anatomical heresy. Villagers no longer spoke of the sleeping girl. They spoke of the thing in the Richter house. And as the year 1875 drew to a close, they realized that the rebellion of her body was just the prelude. The physical vessel was now ready. The house was prepared. The silence was about to break. In the 1870s, the greatest fear of the Victorian mind was not death itself, that was the mistake of it. The era was gripped by taphophobia, the pathological dread of being buried alive. Medical science was still in its infancy. The heartbeat was often so faint it eluded the crude stethoscopes of the day. And suspended animation was a common headline in the evening papers. As Emma Richter's body continued its grotesque transformation, the village of Ohol began to confront a terrifying question. If Emma finally stopped breathing, how would they know she was actually gone? The horror was no longer about her living. It was about the possibility of her waking up 6 feet beneath the Prussian soil. The villagers, driven by a mixture of lingering guilt and primal terror, began to prepare for a funeral that might be a murder. The village council commissioned a local inventor to create a safety coffin specifically for the Richter girl. It was a masterpiece of 19th century paranoia. The box was lined with lead to contain the unholy weight she had acquired. But the true horror lay in the signaling apparatus. A copper tube was to be installed, running from the coffin lid to the surface of the cemetery, providing a meager supply of air should she revive. Attached to her wrist by a silken cord was a bell, mounted on a spring-loaded pole above the grave. If the bell rings, the inventor whispered to Frau Richter, it means she has returned. But pray to God, the wind does not catch it, for the sound of a dead girl calling for help is a sound no man can survive. Before she could be placed in such a vessel, the village demanded a final proof of expiry. The 1800s had developed a series of brutal, quasi-scientific rituals to ensure the suspended were truly dead. The bedroom was once again filled with the smell of coal and singed meat. They performed the Braidwood test, where a needle was driven into the heart. If it moved as the heart beat, the body was alive. They drove the steel into Emma's chest. The needle did not move. It stayed perfectly still, even as the skin around it began to turn that shimmering, oily black. Next they applied the chloride of lime test, a chemical that would cause the skin of a living person to blister and weep, but leave a corpse untouched. They poured the caustic liquid over Emma's stomach. The skin didn't blister. It absorbed the chemical. The liquid vanished into her pores as if she were a thirsty sponge. And for a moment, the room was filled with a sound like a low, satisfied sigh. She is dead, the mayor of Ohol declared, his voice trembling. She must be dead. No living thing can drink poison and remain so still. The atmosphere in the house turned from a hospital to a mortuary. They dressed Emma in a heavy, high-collared burial gown, but they found that her hair, that golden, wire-like growth, had become so intertwined with the floorboards that it had to be hacked away with axes. Each strike of the axe produced a dull metallic thud, and a thick, dark ichor leaked from the severed strands. As they laid her in the lead-lined coffin, the men noticed the dead weight again. It took 6 strong miners to lift her, and as they moved her, her body didn't slump. It remained rigid, a frozen monument of flesh. They did not bury her immediately. Following the custom of the waiting mortuaries, popular in Germany at the time, they kept the coffin open in the parlor for 3 days. A guard was stationed by the bell pull, his eyes never leaving Emma's face. The horror of those 3 nights was the silence. The papery breathing had stopped. The ha-ha-ha-ha was gone. The room was so quiet that the guards began to hear the sound of their own blood rushing in their ears, and then they began to hear a different sound, a scratching, a slow, rhythmic scraping from the inside of the lead lining. It sounded like fingernails on metal, but when they looked, Emma's hands remained folded, her nails blue and still. On a gray, rain-slicked morning, they carried Emma to the Ohol cemetery. The hole they had dug was deep, reaching down into the cold clay. As they lowered the coffin, the bell mechanism was rigged. The copper air pipe was fixed. The silken cord was tied to her cold, marble-hard wrist. The villagers stood back, their hats held over their hearts, watching as the first shovelfuls of earth hit the lid. Thud, thud. Earth to earth, the priest intoned, his voice cracking. Ashes to ashes. Dust to dust. But as the grave was filled, a sudden violent wind swept through the cemetery. The bell atop the grave, the signal for the living, gave a single sharp cling. The crowd froze. The gravediggers dropped their shovels. For a heartbeat, no one moved. They stared at the bell. Was it the wind? Or was it the girl? Was she waking up now, just as the weight of the Prussian earth was pressing down on her lungs? The mayor stepped forward, his face pale. "It was the wind," he commanded, though his eyes were wide with terror. "Finish it. Cover the pipe. Seal the ground." They buried her. They buried the bell, the pipe, and the girl science couldn't explain. But as the last of the mourners left the cemetery, the youngest gravedigger stayed behind. He knelt by the fresh mound of earth and pressed his ear to the copper tube. He didn't hear a scream. He didn't hear a bell. He heard the sound of a woman humming. A low, distorted melody that sounded like a lullaby played backward. The suspended animation had not ended with the burial. It had simply moved underground. Emma Richter was finally in the dark, and in the dark, she was finally free to wake up. The burial of Emma Richter did not bring peace to Ohol. It only buried the terror beneath the frost. While the village tried to look away, the obsession of Dr. Alistair Van Eyck had only curdled into a fever. To a man of the 1800s, a body that could gain weight without food and resist chemical corrosion was not a corpse, it was the ultimate specimen. It was the key to conquering the biological wall. 3 weeks after the bell had rung in the wind, Van Eyck returned. He did not come with a medical bag, but with 3 resurrection men, mercenaries, of the spade who made their living in the shadows of the anatomy schools, under a moonless sky. The iron gates of the Ohol cemetery were picked. The air was thick with a freezing fog that seemed to cling to the gravestones like wet wool. The men worked in a frantic, rhythmic silence. When the shovels finally struck the lead-lined lid, the sound was not a dull thud, but a sharp metallic ring that echoed through the valley. They hauled the coffin out with thick hemp ropes. It was heavier than before, so heavy the ropes groaned and frayed, snapping one by one until the box hit the grass with a bone-jarring impact. When Van Eyck pried the lid open with a crowbar, he didn't find a rotting girl. He found Emma. She was radiant. Her skin had lost its marble translucence and was now a deep, healthy bronze. Her hair had grown back, filling the coffin like a nest of golden snakes. And most terrifyingly, the safety cord tied to her wrist was pulled taut, disappearing into the dark, clenched center of her fist. They did not take her to a hospital. They took her to a makeshift laboratory in the attic of a derelict manor on the outskirts of the village. The room was a forest of Victorian machinery, glass-laden jars, coils of copper wire, and rows of bubbling retorts. Filled with sulfurous acids, Van Eyck was no longer interested. In waking Emma, he wanted to harvest the energy that kept her suspended. He strapped her to a table made of cold iron. The attic windows were kept open to the winter night, allowing the freezing air to circulate, yet the room remained unnaturally warm. Steam rose from Emma's skin, smelling of ozone and crushed violets. "We are going to perform a total galvanic evocation," Van Eyck whispered, his eyes bloodshot and crazed. "We will bypass the brain entirely. We will hook the battery directly into the marrow of the long bones." The resurrection men were kept as feeders for the machinery. They pumped massive bellows to stoke a coal-fired generator in the corner, the gears grinding with a deafening industrial roar. Van Eyck hammered copper spikes into Emma's shoulders and hips. He didn't use a mallet. He used his own weight, driving the metal through the marble flesh. There was no blood. Instead, a faint humming vibration began to emit from the wounds, a sound like 1,000 bees trapped in a jar. "Switch on the jars." Van Eyck screamed over the noise of the generator. The electricity hit in 1873. The world had never seen a discharge of this magnitude. The attic was flooded with a blinding, strobe-like blue light. The air became so ionized that the men's hair stood on end, and blue sparks danced between their fingertips. Emma's body did not jump this time. It did not seizure. It began to glow. The light didn't come from the wires. It came from within her. Her rib cage became transparent, revealing a heart that was no longer a muscle, but a pulsing geometric crystal. The city sounds the medical student had heard through the stethoscope now filled the attic, a roar of voices and machinery that drowned out the generator. Then, the suspension broke. But it didn't break toward life. The copper spikes in Emma's shoulders began to melt, the liquid metal running down her skin in golden tears. The glass Leyden jars shattered simultaneously, sending shards of glass flying like shrapnel. One of the resurrection men screamed as he was pulled toward the table. He wasn't being pulled by gravity. He was being inhaled. The air in the attic was rushing toward Emma's open mouth. The papers on the desk, the tools, the heavy coal shovels, everything was being drawn into the vacuum of her stasis. Van Eyck stood his ground, his face illuminated by the dying blue sparks. "Speak," he commanded. "Tell me what is on the other side of the sleep." Emma's eyes snapped open. They weren't eyes anymore. They were two infinite black tunnels. And for the first time since 1873, she spoke. It wasn't a human voice. It was the sound of a tectonic plate shifting, a deep, sub-bass vibration that made the very foundations of the manor crumble. "We are not asleep," the voice said. "We are just waiting for the lights to go out." The explosion was silent. There was a flash of white light that could be seen from the village of Ohol, followed by a shockwave that flattened the trees for 100 yards around the manor. When the villagers reached the site the next morning, there was no attic. There was no Dr. Van Eyck. There were no resurrection men. The manor was a hollowed-out shell, the stones scorched black. In the center of the ruins sat the iron table. It was twisted and melted, as if it had been made of wax. Emma Richter was gone. The only thing left was the lead-lined coffin lying nearby. It was empty, but the interior was lined with a fine silver frost in the shape of a girl. And on the ground, leading away from the ruins and toward the deep, dark heart of the Prussian forest, were a set of footprints. They weren't the footprints of a girl. They were the footprints of something heavy, something metallic, and something that walked with a terrifying rhythmic precision. The case of suspended animation had ended. The sleeping girl had finally woken up. And as the sun set over the ruins, the villagers of Ohol realized with a cold horror that the thing that had walked out of the fire wasn't Emma. Emma was still in the dark. The thing that had woken up was what had been growing in the dark for 3 years, and now it was hungry. The winter of 1876 descended upon Ohol not with snow, but with a suffocating, unnatural fog. The manor was a blackened ribcage on the hill, and the iron table stood as a monument to Van Eyck's folly. But the true horror was not what had been destroyed. It was the lingering presence of what had been released. In the weeks following the awakening, the village of Ohol began to undergo a slow psychological rot. It started with the children. They refused to sleep in rooms that faced the woods, claiming that the golden wire girl was standing among the trees, her hair woven into the brambles, watching the windows with eyes that didn't reflect the moon. The local economy, once built on the dark tourism of Emma's sleep, collapsed into a state of paranoid isolation. The Emma charms were thrown into the river. The inns were boarded up. The villagers realized that by staring at the girl for 3 years, they had invited her into their minds. They had made themselves part of her suspension. Frau Richter remained in the cottage, a ghost inhabiting a ruin. She did not clean the room where Emma had slept. She sat in the chair, staring at the floorboards where the golden hair had once taken root. She began to claim that the house was leaking. She would find puddles of the black, ink-like substance in the corners of the ceiling. She would hear the rhythmic ha 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 coming from behind the walls. One evening, Father Klimt came to offer her the last rites, for she was wasting away into nothingness. He found her standing in the center of Emma's room, holding a shard of the broken mirror. "She didn't leave, Father," the mother whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "She didn't walk into the woods. She just stopped being small enough for us to see." She showed him the mirror. In the reflection, the room was full, not with people, but with a dense, swirling mass of shadows and golden threads that seemed to connect every piece of furniture, every floorboard, and every person in the village to a single central point, the spot where the bed had been. Emma Richter hadn't woken up and left. She had expanded. She had become the atmosphere of Ohol itself. As the 1800s gave way to the turn of the century, the story of Emma Richter was scrubbed from the official medical records. The Prussian government, embarrassed by the superstition of Ohol, ordered the case files burned. They claimed it was a simple case of viral encephalitis, a sleeping sickness, that ended in a tragic fire. But the oral history of the region tells a different story. To this day, in the deep woods near the ruins of the manor, the trees grow in strange, twisted patterns, their branches coiling like wire rather than wood. No birds nest in those trees. No wolves hunt in those shadows. And in the local cemetery, the grave with the copper pipe remains. The pipe has long since rusted shut, and the bell was stolen a century ago. But the locals still leave a small bowl of milk at the headstone every October. They don't do it out of respect. They do it as a bribe. The case of suspended animation serves as the ultimate dark fable of the Victorian era. It represents the moment science tried to colonize the mystery of the soul and found only a void that was looking back. If you ever find yourself in the quiet corners of Westphalia, near the place they once called Ohol, listen to the wind in the eaves of the old houses. If the wind seems to take on a rhythmic, papery quality, a slow, indrawing breath followed by a hollow exhale, do not investigate. Do not look for the sleeping girl, because Emma Richter is still suspended. She's waiting for the world to grow quiet enough, dark enough, and heavy enough for her to finally, truly open her eyes. And on that day, the suspended animation will not end for her.